She humiliated an ordinary customer only to find out he owned the place and was Clint Eastwood. The Redwood Grill was a restaurant that practically dripped with sophistication. Nestled in the heart of Carmel-by-the-Sea, California, it stood out as a beacon of luxury and exclusivity. The building itself was a work of art, with its sleek glass facade that reflected the sunlight like a jewel and interiors that whispered opulence. Rich, dark wood paneling, polished brass fixtures, and soft ambient lighting gave the space a timeless elegance. A grand chandelier, made entirely of hand-blown glass, hung in the center of the dining area, casting a warm glow over tables adorned with crisp white linens and delicate china. This was the kind of place where reservations were booked weeks in advance, and every dish looked like it belonged in a glossy food magazine. Locals referred to it as a hidden gem, though everyone knew it wasn't hidden at all. It was simply reserved for those who could afford the experience. The Redwood Grill wasn't just a restaurant. It was a statement. For Megan, however, it was just her job. A 24-year-old aspiring actress, she had moved to California chasing big-screen dreams, but found herself stuck waiting tables instead. Megan had hoped her stint at the Redwood Grill would be temporary, a way to make ends meet until she got her big break. But after 2 years, her Hollywood dreams seemed further away than ever. The job, once exciting with its promise of big tips and celebrity sightings, had become little more than a source of frustration. Megan tied her blonde hair into a high ponytail, slipping into her uniform, a tailored black shirt and slacks that were as uncomfortable as they were formal. The pristine dining room sparkled with perfection, but behind the scenes, it was chaos. The kitchen staff barked orders, servers darted around with trays piled high, and Megan found herself drowning in the endless demands of high-maintenance customers. The restaurant's clientele were a mix of the ultra-rich and social climbers desperate to appear wealthy. Megan had dealt with them all. Influencers staging photo shoots with their plates, CEOs demanding wine recommendations, and couples celebrating anniversaries who thought tipping 5% was generous. Their polite facades often slipped into entitlement the moment something wasn't perfect. A steak too rare, a glass of water not refilled fast enough, or an Instagram-worthy dessert arriving 5 minutes late. For Megan, this wasn't the glamorous world she had envisioned when she moved to California. Each shift felt like a grind, and her patience was wearing thin. She glanced at the door, wondering which demanding guest would walk in next. She sighed, plastering on the professional smile she had mastered. After all, at the Redwood Grill, appearances were everything. By noon, the Redwood Grill was buzzing with activity, and Megan was already at her limit. The lunch rush was in full swing, with every table filled and the sound of clinking glasses, muffled conversations, and the occasional sharp laugh bouncing off the walls. Megan moved like a blur between tables, juggling drink orders, delivering entrees, and responding to a barrage of complaints. Table 5 says their salmon is cold. Danny, one of her co-workers, muttered as he passed her with a tray of cocktails. Megan clenched her jaw, nodding without looking up. She was already 3 tables behind and hadn't had a chance to grab a sip of water since her shift started. At table 7, a well-dressed woman waved impatiently for her attention. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice dripping with irritation. "This isn't the sparkling water I ordered. Do I have to do everything myself?" Megan's polite smile felt like it might crack her face. "I'll fix that for you right away," she said through gritted teeth, spinning around to retrieve the correct drink. Behind the counter, she muttered under her breath, "God forbid you lift a finger, Your Highness." As the afternoon dragged on, the demands piled higher. A young couple at table 9 flagged her down, the woman asking sweetly, "Could we get some extra napkins, please?" Megan handed them over with a clipped, "Here you go," before turning on her heel without waiting for a thank you. She heard the woman whisper, "Well, that was rude," but Megan didn't have the energy to care. Every little thing was starting to grate on her nerves. The sound of silverware scraping plates, the endless clink of glasses being refilled, and the constant requests, it all felt like too much. She caught sight of a table full of businessmen laughing loudly, their plates barely touched. Their conversation was about golf, yachts, and something Megan couldn't even begin to relate to. Must be nice, she thought bitterly, walking past them with an empty tray. Megan's mind wandered to what her life could have been. If just one audition had gone differently, she wouldn't be here, sweating under the pressure of rich people's whims. Instead, she'd be on a set somewhere, living the dream she had worked so hard to chase. The thought made her chest tighten, and her frustration bubbled dangerously close to the surface. "Hey, Megan," Danny called, snapping her out of her thoughts. Table 12 just walked in. "It's all yours." Megan glanced over, her practiced smile returning as she grabbed her notepad. "Great," she muttered under her breath. Another customer to deal with. Another battle to fight. Little did she know, Table 12 was about to turn her day, and her life, upside down. The lunchtime frenzy had barely begun to wind down when Megan spotted him. At first glance, the man looked out of place among the polished clientele of the Redwood Grill. He was tall and lean, his shoulders broad under a slightly wrinkled flannel shirt. Faded jeans clung to his legs, and his boots, scuffed and weathered, seemed to have walked more dirt roads than paved ones. The wide-brimmed Stetson in his hand completed the look, giving the impression of a cowboy who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong part of town. Megan raised an eyebrow as he stepped through the glass doors, the sunlight briefly casting a halo around him. She sighed. "What is this place, a steakhouse now?" she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. He didn't match the Redwood Grill's usual clientele. No tailored suit, no designer purse, no air of superiority. Just a quiet confidence that Megan found strangely irritating. The man scanned the room with a measured gaze, eventually making his way to a corner table near the windows. He moved with deliberate ease, neither rushed nor uncertain, as though he had all the time in the world. Megan couldn't help but watch as he settled into his seat, placing his hat carefully on the table and leaning back in his chair. "Seriously," she whispered to Danny, who was passing by with a tray of martinis. "Why is this place letting ranch hands in? Did we lower our standards when I wasn't looking?" Danny smirked, but didn't reply, too busy juggling drinks to get involved in Megan's running commentary. From her vantage point behind the counter, Megan kept one eye on the man as he surveyed the room. His expression was calm, unreadable, as if he were taking in every detail. The chandelier above, the bustle of waitstaff, the elegant diners clinking their glasses. He didn't seem uncomfortable or out of place, and that bothered Megan more than it should have. She couldn't pin down what it was about him that irritated her, but she already knew she didn't like him. When the hostess gestured for Megan to take the table, she groaned internally. Grabbing her notepad, she pasted on her professional smile, though the annoyance simmering beneath it wasn't hard to detect. Little did she know, the man had already noticed her glances and was quietly observing her in return. Approaching the corner table, Megan braced herself. She didn't have high hopes for this interaction. In her experience, customers who dressed like that rarely left tips worth her time. Still, she forced herself to stay professional, even as she felt her patience wearing thin. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone bordering on polite indifference. "Welcome to the Redwood Grill. What can I get for you today?" The man looked up from the menu, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. Megan froze for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the intensity of his gaze. His face was weathered but not unkind, the lines around his mouth suggesting a life of both hard work and quiet smiles. "Just a burger," he said in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to carry more weight than the words themselves. "And a glass of water, please?" Megan blinked. "A burger," she repeated, her pen hovering over the notepad. "That's it? No appetizer? No side of truffle fries? Or anything?" The man's lips twitched into what could almost be called a smile. "Just a burger," he said again, his tone calm and measured. Megan bit back a sarcastic comment, though the words danced on the tip of her tongue. "All right, burger and water," she said, jotting it down. "Coming right up." Her pen tapped against the notepad a little harder than necessary as she turned to leave. As she walked back to the kitchen, she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable. He's treating this place like some roadside diner." Back at the counter, Megan handed the order slip to the kitchen staff with a roll of her eyes. "Table 12, she said, her voice tinged with annoyance. "Burger and water." Real high roller over there. Danny overheard her and chuckled. Not everyone's here for the lobster tail, Megan. She shot him a look, but didn't reply. For some reason, this customer was getting under her skin. It wasn't what he ordered. She'd seen plenty of people order simple meals in this upscale setting. It was the way he carried himself, so calm, so unbothered, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. His composure irritated her more than any entitled complaint she'd fielded that day. When the burger was ready, Megan grabbed the plate and marched back to the corner table. She set it down with a little more force than necessary, her smile thin and forced. "Here you go," she said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Anything else you need? Or is this just fine?" The man looked at the burger, then back at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. "No," he said simply. "This looks perfect. Thank you." Megan blinked, momentarily thrown off by his sincerity. She lingered for a second longer than she meant to, unsure why. There was something unnerving about the way he watched her. Not in a creepy way, but as though he was quietly sizing her up, seeing more than she wanted him to. It made her self-conscious in a way she couldn't explain. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, retreating quickly before he could say anything else. But even as she moved on to her other tables, she couldn't shake the feeling that this customer wasn't like anyone she'd served before. The lunch rush had settled into a manageable rhythm, and Megan finally found a moment to breathe. She leaned against the counter, watching as the man at table 12 ate his burger with deliberate slowness. It wasn't unusual for customers to linger, but something about his calm, unhurried demeanor rubbed her the wrong way. Danny walked by, carrying a tray of desserts, and Megan nudged him with her elbow. "Hey, have you seen table 12? She asked, a smirk tugging at her lips. Danny glanced over his shoulder. "The cowboy guy? Yeah. What about him?" Megan rolled her eyes dramatically. "Doesn't he look like he just walked off a ranch? I mean, who wears boots like that to a place like this? What's next? Someone riding in on horseback?" Danny chuckled, shaking his head. "You're too much. Maybe he's just passing through. He seems harmless enough." "Harmless," Megan muttered. "He's probably some drifter who stumbled in here thinking it's a diner. I'll be lucky if he tips more than $1. Burgers and water? Seriously? This isn't a truck stop?" Danny gave her a look, but didn't respond, clearly more focused on getting his tray to the right table. Megan, emboldened by her own words, glanced back at table 12. The man was still eating, his expression unreadable as he glanced around the restaurant. For a brief moment, his eyes flicked toward her. Megan quickly turned away, her stomach twisting. Had he hurt her? She brushed it off. "Doesn't matter," she muttered to herself, grabbing a tray of drinks for another table. What's he gonna do? Leave a Yelp review? When she returned to his table to refill his water, Megan placed the glass down with a little too much force, causing it to wobble precariously. "Here you go," she said, her voice overly sweet. "Anything else? Or is this fine for you?" The man looked up at her, his piercing gaze steady but calm. "This is perfect, thank you," he said, his tone polite and measured. Megan forced a tight smile, biting back the urge to say something snarky. As she turned to leave, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. "Not like I'm expecting a big tip from a burger order anyway." She walked away without looking back, missing the way the man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. He didn't react or call her out, but there was something about his composure that made her skin crawl. It was as if he was waiting for something, and that made Megan feel more unsettled than she cared to admit. As the clock ticked toward the end of the lunch rush, Megan found herself glancing at table 12 more often than she wanted to admit. The man was finished with his meal, casually sipping the last of his water. He seemed in no hurry to leave, which only irritated Megan further. She grabbed his check, ready to close out the table and move on. She approached with the same forced smile she'd been wearing all day. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint hint of smugness. "Whenever you're ready." The man nodded, his expression calm as ever. "Thank you," he said simply, folding the bill in half and tucking it into his pocket without looking at it. As he stood to leave, Megan felt a brief flicker of triumph. She'd handled the table, delivered his meal, and gotten the last word. She was sure he'd leave an underwhelming tip, but at least he was finally gone. That triumph was short-lived. Just as the man reached the door, Carol, the restaurant manager, emerged from the back office. Her sharp eyes scanned the dining room before lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Eastwood," she called out, her tone a mix of excitement and respect. Megan froze, her heart stopping mid-beat. "Mr. Eastwood?" She glanced at the door just in time to see the man turn around, tipping his Stetson slightly as Carol rushed over to greet him. "Good to see you," Carol said warmly, shaking his hand. "I wasn't expecting you today. Thank you for stopping by." Megan's stomach dropped as the pieces clicked into place. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she replayed every interaction in her mind. The casual demeanor, the piercing gaze, the unbothered calm. It was all so obvious now. She had insulted Clint Eastwood, not just a legendary actor and director, but the owner of the Redwood Grill. She stood frozen behind the counter, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand as Carol continued talking. "We've been doing our best to keep everything running smoothly," Carol gushed. "This place means so much to you, and we're honored to have you here." Clint's eyes flicked to Megan for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no smugness, just that same calm, knowing look that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. Megan wanted to sink into the floor. All her snarky comments, her careless attitude, it had all been directed at him. She could only hope he hadn't overheard everything she said. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," Clint said to Carol, tipping his hat once more. "You're doing a great job." "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," Carol said, beaming. She turned to Megan as Clint walked out the door. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's so hands-on with this place. Every detail. He's personally approved." Megan managed a weak smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, that's wow," she stammered. As Carol turned back to the dining room, Megan sank against the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had no idea what to do next, but one thing was clear. She had just humiliated herself in front of one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood, and the owner of the restaurant she worked at. Megan stood rooted to the spot as the door swung shut behind Clint Eastwood. The quiet jingle of the bell above the entrance sounded almost mocking. Her stomach twisted in knots, and her face burned with humiliation as the realization hit her like a freight train. She had insulted Clint Eastwood, not just any customer, but the Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and cultural icon. And, as if that weren't bad enough, the owner of the Redwood Grill. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction, every careless word she'd muttered under her breath. She recalled the sarcastic way she'd tossed his water onto the table, the condescending comments about his order, and her mocking remarks to Danny about his cowboy vibe. The embarrassment was unbearable. What if he heard me? She thought. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the ground to swallow her whole. Carol's voice snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. "Megan, can you believe it? Clint Eastwood owns this place, and he just dropped by. It's such an honor." "Why, yeah," Megan stammered, barely able to form words. "That's incredible." Carol didn't seem to notice Megan's pale face or shaky voice. She continued gushing. "He's so humble, isn't he? He doesn't even make a big deal about being here. That's what makes him such a great guy." Megan nodded numbly, unable to focus on anything Carol was saying. Her gaze darted to the door, as if hoping Clint might miraculously walk back in and give her a chance to undo her mistakes. Instead, all she could think about was the look he had given her as he left. It wasn't angry or smug. It was calm, composed, and knowing, almost like he knew exactly what she was feeling. She clenched her notepad tighter, her knuckles turning white. How could she have been so oblivious? She had worked at the Redwood Grill for 2 years and had heard plenty of stories about the mysterious owner who occasionally stopped by. But she had never imagined that he'd show up looking like a casual diner, blending in like any other customer. As the lunch shift wound down, Megan retreated to the break room, sinking into a chair. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. What if he tells Carol about my attitude? What if I get fired? The thought of losing her job made her stomach churn. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and her student loans weren't going to pay themselves. But worse than the fear of losing her job was the shame of knowing how she had treated someone who deserved far better. For the first time, Megan felt the full weight of her behavior. not just toward Clint, but toward countless other customers she had dismissed or judged unfairly. The realization stung, but deep down, she knew she had no one to blame but herself. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of dread in her stomach. She had barely slept, tossing and turning as she replayed the events of the previous day over and over again. Her nerves were frayed, and her usual mask of professionalism felt paper-thin. Every time Carol walked by, Megan flinched, half expecting her manager to pull her aside and deliver the scolding, or termination, she deserved. By lunchtime, Megan's anxiety had reached a boiling point. She was so on edge that she nearly dropped a tray of iced teas when the front door opened and she heard a familiar voice. "Well, looks like you're busy today." Her head snapped up, and there he was, Clint Eastwood, standing just inside the door, his hands casually resting in his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, in jeans and a flannel shirt, his Stetson perched firmly on his head. But this time, Megan couldn't mistake him for just another customer. His presence felt commanding, even as he glanced around the room with the same quiet curiosity he'd shown before. Megan's heart sank. Why is he back? Is he here to complain? She couldn't avoid him forever, and the thought of facing him made her palms sweat. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her notepad and walked over to where he had just sat down. "Good afternoon, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Welcome back. Can I get you something to drink?" Clint looked up at her, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and Megan felt her nerves unraveling. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, just a small, faint curve of his lips. "Water's fine," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Thanks." Megan nodded quickly and turned to leave, but something stopped her. She swallowed hard, gathering her courage, and turned back around. "Mr. Eastwood," she blurted, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For yesterday. I wasn't." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wasn't professional. Or respectful. And you didn't deserve that." Clint tilted his head slightly, studying her for a moment. Then he nodded, his expression softening. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Megan felt a rush of relief, though it was short-lived as he continued speaking. "But let me tell you something," he added, his voice calm but firm. "You never know who you're talking to, or what they might be going through. A little kindness can go a long way. Not just for them, but for you too." Megan felt her cheeks flush. His words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that hit her harder than any reprimand ever could. He wasn't angry or condescending. He was offering her advice, the kind that came from someone who had lived and learned. I understand," Megan said quietly, nodding. "Thank you." Clint gave her a small smile. "Good. Just remember, how you treat people in the tough moments says more about you than anything else." With that, he leaned back in his chair, as relaxed and unbothered as ever. Megan walked away, her thoughts swirling. She felt a mix of shame, gratitude, and a strange sense of hope. Clint Eastwood hadn't just forgiven her. He taught her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The rest of Megan's shift passed in a blur, but Clint Eastwood's words lingered in her mind long after he left. As she clocked out that night, his advice replayed in her head like a mantra. You never know who you're talking to or what they might be going through. A little kindness can go a long way. Those words hit her harder than she had expected. It wasn't just about Clint. It was about all the customers she had dismissed, judged, or treated with impatience over the past 2 years. When Megan got home, she sat on her small couch, staring at the ceiling. Her frustrations with the job had been building for so long. She hadn't even noticed how much they'd seeped into her attitude. She had taken out her own struggles, her stalled dreams, her exhaustion, her financial worries, on people who had no idea what she was going through. Clint's calm demeanor and gentle wisdom had shown her something she hadn't wanted to admit. Her attitude said more about her than it did about her circumstances. The next day, Megan walked into work with a fresh resolve. It wasn't like flipping a switch. She knew it would take effort to change her habits. But she was determined to try. When the lunch rush began, Megan found herself at table 7, where a frazzled mother with 2 young children was struggling to keep her kids from spilling drinks and tossing food onto the floor. Normally, Megan would have rolled her eyes and sighed inwardly, but this time, she knelt down and smiled. "Don't worry," she said, gently handing the toddler a new crayon. "Kids are the best critics. If they're having fun, we must be doing something right." The mother looked up, startled, and smiled back. "Thank you," she said softly, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. At table 3, an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials twice. Instead of rushing through, Megan took her time, describing each dish with care and even offering a recommendation for the grilled salmon. By the end of the meal, the couple left a handwritten thank you note on the receipt, along with a tip that was more generous than Megan could have imagined. Her coworkers began to notice the change. Danny teased her, saying, "Who are you? And what have you done with Megan?" But his tone was light, and Megan could tell he was impressed. Even Carol pulled her aside after a shift one evening. "You've been different lately," Carol said, her usual stern demeanor softening. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed, and so have I." For the first time in a long while, Megan felt proud of her work. She wasn't just getting through the day anymore. She was connecting with people, finding small moments of joy in an otherwise demanding job. It wasn't the glamorous Hollywood dream she had envisioned, but it was something real, and it mattered. Weeks later, Megan had almost forgotten the knot of dread that used to settle in her stomach whenever the door to the restaurant opened. She had come to embrace her shifts at the Redwood Grill, taking each interaction as an opportunity to practice patience, kindness, and care. Her change in attitude hadn't gone unnoticed. Regulars began to request her section, and her tips improved dramatically. Megan felt lighter, freer, like she was finally moving forward, not just in her job, but in her life. One crisp afternoon, the familiar jingle of the front door caught her attention. Megan glanced up, and her heart skipped a beat. Standing there, as unassuming as ever, was Clint Eastwood. He was dressed in his usual casual attire, his Stetson perched on his head and his hands resting casually in his pockets. For a moment, Megan froze, the memory of their last encounter flashing through her mind. But this time, she wasn't filled with dread. Instead, she took a deep breath, grabbed her notepad, and approached his table with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice steady and genuine. "It's good to see you again. Can I get you anything to drink?" Clint looked up at her, his piercing blue eyes studying her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, a full, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Water's fine, thank you," he said, his tone as calm as ever. Megan nodded and quickly brought him a glass, determined to provide the kind of service she now prided herself on. When she returned to take his order, Clint didn't say much, but there was something about his quiet demeanor that made her feel at ease. By the time his meal was finished, Megan couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She placed the check on the table with a polite, "Whenever you're ready." As Clint reached into his pocket for his wallet, he glanced up at her. "You've changed," he said simply, his voice steady but kind. Megan blinked, caught off guard. I guess I have," she admitted, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you for everything," Clint nodded, leaving a few bills on the table before standing to leave. Megan hesitated for a moment before picking up the check, and when she did, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting beneath the generous tip was a small, handwritten note in Clint's steady hand. "Every moment is a chance to grow. Keep it up." Megan's chest swelled with emotion as she read the words. She looked toward the door, just in time to see Clint tipping his hat to Carol on his way out. For a moment, she stood there, holding the note, a sense of clarity washing over her. This job, this moment, it wasn't the end of the road. It was a chance to learn, to grow, and to become someone better. Megan smiled, sliding the note into her pocket. Clint Eastwood had changed more than just her approach to work. He had shifted her perspective on life itself. As she returned to her other tables, Megan couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Sometimes it wasn't the big breaks or the life-changing moments that made the biggest impact. Sometimes it was the quiet lessons, the unexpected encounters, and the people who reminded you to be just a little kinder every day. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.